When peace feels unfamiliar, restoration begins here. This is P.I.P.E Podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back to P.I.P.E Podcast. I'm Kezia, and today feels less like a podcast episode, and it'll be more like a conversation. A few days ago, I spent 4 days at a women's retreat. I was expecting rest, and I was expecting quiet time, and I definitely expected time with God. What I didn't expect was that I was going to come face to face with a version of myself I hadn't seen in a very long time. And one of the afternoons, we were asked to write some letters. I didn't think much of it. I've done all this before, journaling and processing things, and I've spent so many years trying to understand my story. But I submitted to the process, and as I started writing, something unexpected happened. I began to think about all the identities I had carried throughout my life. Not experiences and not memories. Identities. Labels. The words people had spoken over me. The things that people had called me. Assumptions that people had made about me. And there are so many opinions that had been formed about me. And as I sat there writing, I realized something. I spent years carrying things that never belonged to me. Maybe you've done that too. Maybe someone told you who you were before you had the chance to decide for yourself. Maybe someone has labeled you or reduced you to your very worst moment. Maybe someone has projected their own pain onto you. And after enough years, you'll stop questioning whether those things are true. And you will just carry them. I started thinking about all the ways I had stopped, and I began to accept identities that were never mine. And don't misunderstand me. I believe in accountability. And I believe we should own our mistakes. I believe healing absolutely requires honesty. But accountability and identity, they are not the same thing. Owning something you did wrong is very healthy. But carrying an identity that never belonged to you is absolutely not. And somewhere in the middle of writing those letters, I just felt God gently ask me some questions. Who were you before all of this? Who were you before the labels? Before the disappointments? Before survival? And that question has stayed with me. Because another memory surfaced. Not a specific event, but a sentence. A sentence that had been spoken over me so many years ago. I was told I was happiest in a cold, dark room. And for a long time, I believed this. Not consciously, but something so deep inside of me had accepted it as part of who I was. The one who would pull away, the one who stayed to herself, the one who didn't need anyone, and the one who was safest alone. And maybe there were seasons where that could look true from the outside, because when I was hurt, I withdrew. When I felt rejected, I definitely retreated. And when I felt unsafe, I disconnected. But sitting there in this place, I realized something. I have never been happiest in a cold, dark room. There's a difference. The room wasn't joy. The room had no peace. The room wasn't who I was. The room was my protection. That room was self-preservation. That room was a place I learned to go when I just didn't feel safe. And what broke my heart was realizing how many years I spent confusing survival with identity. Because eventually I stopped seeing the room as somewhere I went. I started seeing it as someone who I was. And it wasn't. It never was. And as I was writing, I realized there's another thing I carried for most of my life. This time it was a vow. Not one I said out loud, or even one I consciously chose, but one I made so deep inside. And this vow was, I will do and say whatever I needed to do or say to be safe. And when I really sat with that, I realized how much of my life had been shaped by that decision. Because once I no longer felt safe with someone, something inside of me happened. I didn't always feel it immediately. Sometimes I stayed for years. Sometimes I just kept showing up. And sometimes I would even smile. And I would play the role everyone had expected me to play. But inside, I had already left. Because once someone crossed whatever line my heart considered safety, I stopped seeing them as the same. I stopped seeing them as a home. I stopped seeing them as family. I stopped seeing them as my safe place. And from that moment forward, I wasn't building a future there. I was surviving until I could get somewhere safe. Looking back, I can see that pattern so clearly now. I wasn't trying to be cold or to punish anyone. I wasn't trying to be distant. I was surviving. That little girl inside of me had learned that safety was more important than connection. That realization was painful because I see how much of my life was organized around feeling safe. Not known, not connected, not vulnerable, safe. And there's a difference. Because when safety becomes your highest goal, you will stop living. You start managing and self-protecting. You start waiting. You start surviving. And I was in that place when I arrived at the retreat. I didn't realize it, but it was there. People think healing retreats are all peaceful and beautiful. But when I got there, I had this underline of anger. And I was carrying rage. I was so frustrated. And part of me just really resented that I had to be there. I didn't want to sit still. I didn't want to be isolated with my own thoughts. I didn't want to slow down enough to feel what was underneath everything. Because sometimes we stay busy so we don't have to listen. And when all the distractions disappear, what remains can be uncomfortable. What surfaced for me wasn't immediate peace. It was grief. It was all of the disappointment. It was a deep sadness for all the things that I had survived. It was a sadness over the ways I had to abandon myself, trying to survive. And there were a few times I wanted to leave and go home. Because that's what I'd always done. Retreat, withdraw, leave emotionally, go back to my room. But this time, I stayed. I stayed with the discomfort. I stayed with the questions. I stayed in my grief. And something shifted. I wasn't pretending to be anyone but me. I wasn't trying to be impressive. I wasn't trying to be the strongest woman in the room. I wasn't trying to give all the answers. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just me. That felt so vulnerable. Because when you have spent years trying to survive, authenticity feels extremely risky. But the more honest I became, the lighter I began to feel. The more real I became, the more connected I felt. And something happened that surprised me. Joy showed up, not because my circumstances changed, not because all my answers were answered, not because all my questions were answered, not because life suddenly became easy. Joy, real joy, the kind that feels like a gift, the kind that catches you off guard, The kind that reminds you that something beautiful is still alive underneath all of those layers. Even one of the women commented that my eyes just looked different. And I knew exactly what she meant. There was a softness there, a light. There was freedom. For the first time in too long, in front of people, I wasn't trying to be anyone but myself. I wasn't carrying all of those labels. I wasn't performing. I wasn't hiding. And I realized something. I'm realizing healing is many things. And it's not always becoming something new. Sometimes healing is remembering who you were before survival took over. Before you were labeled. Before the fear. Before the disappointment. Before the hiding. I don't think I was ever created to just survive. I was created to love, to be loved, to connect, to create, to laugh. I was created to experience joy. I was created to belong. And maybe that's what God was showing me during those 4 days. Not how to become someone different, but how to come home to myself. The self He created before fear convinced me to hide. The self He created before survival became my identity. The self He created in the beginning. This is why this retreat affected me so deeply. I didn't come home with all of the answers. I came home with a question. Who was I before I learned to hide? And maybe that's the question I want to leave with you today. Who were you before the heartbreak? Before the disappointment? Before the labels? Before the fear? Before survival became your identity? Who were you before you learned to hide? Because I don't think that person is gone. I think they're still there, waiting to be remembered. So, thank you for sitting with me today. This is P.I.P.E. Plug into positive energy, and I will see you next time. Thank you for sitting with us today, where restoration begins.